My name is Margaret Whitfield, and I am 53 years old. I was standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning when the wedding invitation arrived in the mail, cream-colored with elegant gold lettering announcing my son Ethan's marriage to Cassidy Monroe. As I held that invitation in my trembling hands, I felt the weight of a secret I had carried for 5 long years, pressing down on my chest like a stone. That beautiful Victorian house downtown where Ethan and Cassidy had been living, the one they rented through a property management company, the one they believed belonged to some faceless investment group, it was mine. I owned it. I had purchased it secretly, hidden behind an LLC with a name that bore no connection to our family. The property management company handled everything under the business name Riverside Properties, and my son had no idea his own mother was his landlord. As I traced my fingers over the embossed letters of his name, I wondered for the 1,000th time if keeping this secret had been wisdom or foolishness. The doorbell rang, shattering my thoughts, and when I opened it, there stood Cassidy, my future daughter-in-law, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes and urgent news about the house. Before we dive into this story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. If you have ever dealt with a difficult family situation, or know someone who has struggled with manipulation in relationships, this story is going to resonate with you deeply. Please hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories about real family drama, betrayal, and ultimately, redemption. Trust me, what happens next is going to shock you. Now, let me take you back to how this all began. 5 years before that wedding invitation arrived, my life had been turned completely upside down. My husband, Thomas, the love of my life and my partner for 28 years, died suddenly of a massive heart attack at the age of 55. One moment he was laughing at the dinner table, telling me about his day at work, and the next moment he was gone. The grief was overwhelming, a crushing wave that threatened to drown me every single day. But Thomas had been a careful man, a planner, and he left me well provided for. When the estate was settled, I found myself the owner of multiple properties around the city, investment accounts, and more money than I had ever imagined having. It should have brought comfort, but instead it brought anxiety, because I knew that money changes people, and I worried about what it might do to my children. My son Ethan was 25 years old at the time, struggling to find his footing in his career as a junior graphic designer. He had been dating Cassidy for only 6 months when Thomas passed away, and from the very beginning, something about her set off alarm bells in my gut. She was beautiful, charming, and always said the right things, but there was a calculation behind her eyes that made me deeply uncomfortable. I watched the way she pushed Ethan to move faster in their relationship, how she steered conversations toward money and security, how she made little comments about his potential inheritance. My best friend Helen, who had known me for 30 years, saw it too. After meeting Cassidy for the first time at a family dinner, Helen pulled me aside and whispered in my ear with genuine concern in her voice that the girl was after something, and it was not just love. About 8 months after Thomas died, Ethan came to me excited about a house he had found. It was a stunning Victorian on Maple Street, 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a brick fireplace, and a garden that got morning sunlight. He had been living in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates, and this house represented everything he dreamed of for his future. The problem was, the rent was $1,800 a month, which was stretching his budget dangerously thin, even with roommates helping. I watched him fall in love with that house, and I made a decision that would change everything. Without telling anyone, not even Helen at first, I contacted the real estate agent and bought the property outright for $375,000. I set up a limited liability company called Riverside Properties LLC, hired Sterling Management Group to handle all tenant interactions, set the rent at a reasonable rate that Ethan could afford with his roommates, and became his anonymous landlord. My reasoning seemed sound at the time. I wanted to give my son stability without him knowing it came from me. I wanted to protect him from the burden of feeling indebted to his mother. Thomas and I had raised him to be independent, to make his own way in the world, and I feared that if he knew I owned the house, it would undermine his sense of self-reliance. But there was another reason, one I barely admitted to myself. I did not trust Cassidy, and I wanted to maintain some measure of control over a situation that felt increasingly dangerous. If things went badly, if Cassidy showed her true colors, I would have leverage. I could protect my son in ways he did not even know he needed protecting. Helen, when I finally confessed what I had done, looked at me with a mixture of understanding and worry and asked me a question that haunted me for years after. She asked if I was being a protective mother or a controlling one, and I honestly did not know the answer. The early warning signs about Cassidy came quickly after Ethan moved into the house. She visited me less than a week after he had settled in and casually mentioned over coffee that she thought it would be better if Ethan's roommates moved out so they could have the place to themselves. When I gently suggested that might strain his finances, she waved her hand dismissively and said with a tight smile that they would figure it out, that love was more important than money. But I noticed she wore designer handbags and expensive shoes while claiming to be frugal and saving for their future. I noticed how she steered every family conversation toward Thomas' estate, asking innocent-sounding questions about property values and investments. She made passive-aggressive comments about my lifestyle, suggesting I lived too simply for someone with my resources, implying I was selfish for not being more generous with family. The mask was slipping, but only I seemed to see it. Ethan was completely enchanted, seeing only the charming, supportive girlfriend who believed in his dreams. My internal conflict grew with each passing month. Should I tell him the truth about the house? Was I wrong to keep this secret? Thomas would have told me to trust our son's judgment, to let him make his own mistakes and learn from them. But my intuition, that deep mother's instinct, screamed at me that something terrible was coming and I needed to be ready. When Cassidy showed up at my door that Tuesday morning with the wedding invitation still fresh in my hand, she was carrying a large portfolio folder and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. She swept past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation and spread architectural drawings and contractor estimates across my coffee table. She announced with breathless enthusiasm that she and Ethan had the most wonderful news. They wanted to renovate the house before the wedding, to make it perfect for starting their married life together. She had already contacted 3 contractors, gotten estimates, and drawn up plans. All they needed now was approval from the landlord, and since they had been such excellent tenants for over 4 years, surely that would not be a problem. I felt my stomach drop as I looked at the papers spread before me. I had to pretend to know nothing about who owned the property, had to play the role of the concerned mother rather than the actual landlord who had every right to say no to these outrageous demands. I asked her carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral, what kind of renovations she had in mind. Her eyes lit up as she walked me through the plans with the confidence of someone who had already decided this would happen. She wanted to knock down the wall between the kitchen and dining room, creating an open concept space. She wanted all new appliances, high-end stainless steel, everything. She wanted the master bathroom completely gutted and redesigned with a walk-in shower and a soaking tub. The estimates totaled almost $50,000. And she said, with perfect casualness, that of course the landlord should pay for most of it, since it would significantly increase the property value. The situation escalated the very next day when I received a phone call on my personal cell phone from a number I did not recognize. When I answered, a smooth male voice introduced himself as David from Sterling Management Group, the company I had hired to manage my properties. He sounded apologetic and confused as he explained that one of my tenants, a Miss Cassidy Monroe, had somehow obtained my private contact information and had been quite insistent about speaking directly with the property owner. My blood ran cold. I had been so careful to keep everything anonymous, using the LLC name, routing all communications through the management company, and yet somehow Cassidy had managed to charm or manipulate her way to my phone number. David did not know, of course, that the tenant in question was about to become my daughter-in-law. I took a deep breath and told him I would handle it, that he should give Miss Monroe my number and let her believe I was simply another investor, someone named Mrs. Riverside. The phone call from Cassidy came that same evening. She used her sweetest voice, the one that could melt butter, and introduced herself as a long-term tenant who absolutely loved the property and wanted to discuss some exciting improvement opportunities. I played my part, disguising my voice slightly, making it more formal and businesslike. As Mrs. Riverside, I listened to her pitch, which was far more aggressive than what she had presented to me as Margaret the mother. She argued that the house was outdated, that comparable properties in the neighborhood were being renovated, that she and her fiancé were prepared to sign a longer lease in exchange for the improvements. When I suggested diplomatically that such extensive renovations were not in the budget at this time, her tone shifted. The sweetness evaporated like morning dew, replaced by something harder. She said that she hoped the landlord understood that tenants who felt neglected tended to look for other options, that it would be unfortunate if excellent long-term renters decided to move elsewhere. It was a veiled threat, and we both knew it. The situation with my son became increasingly painful. 2 days after my conversation with Cassidy as Mrs. Riverside, Ethan called me sounding frustrated and tired. He said that Cassidy really loved the house and wanted to make it more their own, that she had some ideas for improvements, and he was wondering if I could lend them some money to help with renovations. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. My son was calling his mother, asking to borrow money to renovate a house that I secretly owned, a house where his future wife was already manipulating the situation from every possible angle. I gently refused, suggesting that they should be focusing their financial resources on the wedding and their future rather than pouring money into a rental property. I could hear the disappointment in his voice, and worse, I could hear Cassidy's voice in the background saying something I could not quite make out. When Ethan hung up, he sounded distant in a way that frightened me deeply. Cassidy's retaliation was swift and calculated. Over the next few weeks, I found myself increasingly excluded from wedding planning activities. The engagement party that I had offered to host was politely declined, with Cassidy explaining that they wanted something small and intimate with just their closest friends. The bridal shower was organized by Cassidy's mother and sisters, and I received my invitation almost as an afterthought, arriving so late that I had barely a week's notice. When I attended, I was seated away from the family table, treated with polite coldness by Cassidy's relatives, who had clearly been told some version of events that painted me as unsupportive and difficult. Helen attended with me and witnessed the whole uncomfortable afternoon. She squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that she could see exactly what was happening, that Cassidy was systematically poisoning my relationship with my son, isolating him from anyone who might see through her manipulation. The appearance of my first real ally in this nightmare came from an unexpected source. David from Sterling Management called me one afternoon, sounding genuinely concerned. He had been in the property business for 15 years and had dealt with thousands of tenants, and something about this situation was not sitting right with him. He told me that Cassidy had been calling the office repeatedly, asking detailed questions about the ownership structure of the property, trying to find out information about Riverside Properties LLC. She had even gone so far as to ask if she could speak directly with other properties in the portfolio, claiming she might be interested in investing herself. David's instincts told him something was off. And when he did a little discreet checking, he found that Cassidy had hired a private investigator to research the LLC and its connections. He wanted me to know that someone was actively trying to uncover the ownership, and I needed to be prepared. I thanked him profusely and asked him to keep me informed of any developments. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my carefully constructed wall of secrecy was developing cracks, and the situation was spiraling toward a confrontation I had desperately hoped to avoid. The real nightmare began about 2 months before the wedding when Ethan stopped calling me. For 3 weeks, my phone remained silent except for brief, cold text messages responding to my increasingly worried questions. The wedding was approaching rapidly. I had not been asked to help with a single planning detail, and my son was treating me like a stranger. Finally, I received a text message directly from Cassidy that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. She wrote in carefully chosen words that she and Ethan had decided to keep the wedding ceremony small and intimate, that they were limiting the guest list to only their very closest family and friends. She apologized with false sweetness for any inconvenience, but she hoped I would understand. When the actual guest allocation was revealed through my daughter Patricia, I discovered that I had been granted permission to invite exactly 5 people while Cassidy's extended family was bringing over 50 guests. I was being systematically erased from my own son's wedding, and he was allowing it to happen. Helen refused to let me suffer alone. She had watched this situation develop with growing anger, and she decided to take matters into her own hands by doing something I had been too afraid to do myself. She hired a private investigator, not to spy on my son, but to find out the truth about Cassidy Monroe. What the investigator uncovered was explosive. Cassidy had been married before to a man named Richard Brennan from a wealthy Boston family. The marriage had lasted less than 2 years before ending in a contentious divorce. Helen managed to track Richard down through mutual acquaintances, and when she called him and explained that Cassidy was about to marry again, there was a long silence on the phone before he started talking. Richard told Helen a story that made my blood run cold. He said that Cassidy had targeted him specifically because of his family's wealth and social connections. She had been charming and perfect during their courtship, but the mask came off as soon as the wedding was over. When Richard refused to give her access to his trust fund and his parents began to see through her manipulation, Cassidy fabricated domestic abuse allegations, made his life a living hell, and then took him to the cleaners in the divorce settlement. He had lost half his assets and his relationship with some family members who believed her lies. He warned Helen that Cassidy was dangerous, that she studied her targets carefully, and that she always had a long-term plan for extracting maximum value. Armed with this information, I made what turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. I called Patricia, Ethan's older sister who had always been close to him, and I called a meeting with both my children at Patricia's house. I brought printed documentation of everything Helen's investigator had found, including court records from the divorce, Richard's testimony, and a timeline of Cassidy's relationship patterns. I thought that if I showed Ethan the truth, the evidence would speak for itself, and he would see what I had seen all along. Instead, the meeting exploded into the worst family fight we had ever had. Ethan looked at the papers I spread across Patricia's dining room table, and his face turned bright red with fury. He shouted at me that I had hired someone to investigate his fiancée, that I had violated Cassidy's privacy and his trust in the most unforgivable way possible. He said I was a controlling, jealous mother who could not stand to see him happy with someone else. Patricia tried to mediate, tried to get him to at least look at the evidence, but he refused. He gathered up all the papers, tore them in half, threw them in Patricia's fireplace, and told me he needed space from me. He said not to contact him until after the wedding, that maybe by then I would have learned to respect his choices and his wife. Then he walked out, and I sat there sobbing while Patricia held me and told me over and over that this was not my fault. But Cassidy was not content with simply driving a wedge between me and my son. She launched what I can only describe as a calculated smear campaign designed to turn everyone in the family against me. She created a group chat on her phone with all the wedding guests, conveniently excluding me, and she began sharing her side of the story. She told them that I had hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on her, that I had tried to bribe her to leave Ethan, that I was making his life miserable because I could not stand the thought of him loving someone else more than he loved his mother. She painted herself as the victim of a controlling, emotionally abusive mother-in-law, and because Cassidy was so charming and convincing, people believed her. Relatives who had known me for decades began treating me coolly at family gatherings. I overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. Patricia showed me some of the messages from the group chat, and I felt physically sick reading the lies Cassidy had crafted about me. She was systematically destroying my reputation, and I had no way to defend myself without looking exactly like the crazy person she was claiming I was. The situation with the house deteriorated in parallel with my family relationships. Cassidy, frustrated that Mrs. Riverside had refused to approve her renovation demands, began playing games with the rent. She started withholding $500 each month, sending checks for only $1,300 instead of the full $1,800. When David from Sterling Management contacted her about the shortfall, she claimed with saccharine sweetness that she was deducting money for repairs and maintenance that the landlord had failed to address. She documented phantom problems like a leaky faucet that the maintenance crew found perfectly functional, a faulty furnace that was actually working fine, and mold in the basement that did not exist. David sent me detailed reports of her complaints, along with the maintenance crew's findings that nothing was wrong. As Mrs. Riverside, I had every legal right to begin eviction proceedings for non-payment of rent, but I was trapped in an impossible situation. If I evicted my own son and his fiancée just weeks before their wedding, I would destroy any remaining chance of repairing our relationship, and Cassidy would have the ultimate proof that I was the monster she claimed. The breaking point came about 3 weeks before the wedding when I attempted one final time to reach my son. I drove to his office building downtown and waited in the parking lot until I saw him leaving for lunch. I approached him carefully, keeping my voice calm and steady even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I told him I loved him, that I only wanted his happiness, that I understood he was angry with me, but could we please talk about this before the wedding? Ethan's face was cold in a way I had never seen before. He said that Cassidy had been right about me from the beginning, that I was toxic and controlling, that every mother thinks no woman is good enough for her son, but I had taken it to a pathological extreme. He said the only way we could have a relationship going forward was if I apologized to Cassidy publicly, if I accepted her completely, and if I stopped trying to interfere in their lives. Then he got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing alone in that parking lot feeling like I had just lost my son forever. I sat in my car for over an hour crying so hard I could barely breathe, and I honestly wondered if I would ever recover from this pain. Just when I thought the situation could not possibly get worse, I received a phone call that revealed a betrayal so deep and unexpected that it nearly broke me completely. My younger sister Dorothy, who lived in Seattle and whom I had not seen in over a year, called to tell me she was flying in for Ethan's wedding. I was surprised because Dorothy and I had never been particularly close. She had always been somewhat jealous of my life, my marriage to Thomas, the financial security we had built together. But she was still my sister. And I felt a flicker of hope that maybe she would be an ally in this nightmare. That hope died the moment she arrived at my house 2 days later. She walked in with her suitcase, looked around my home with barely concealed resentment, and immediately launched into a lecture about how I was ruining Ethan's happiness. She said that Cassidy had reached out to her months ago, that they had been talking regularly, and that Cassidy had opened her eyes to how controlling and manipulative I had become since Thomas died. I stood there in my own living room, feeling like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet as Dorothy revealed the depth of her betrayal. She admitted with shocking casualness that she and Cassidy had been communicating behind my back for over 6 months. Cassidy had found Dorothy through social media, had cultivated a friendship with her, and had been feeding her a carefully constructed narrative about the terrible mother-in-law who was trying to destroy true love. But there was more to it than simple manipulation. Dorothy confessed, almost proudly, that she was deeply in debt. She had developed a serious gambling problem over the past few years, racking up $85,000 in casino debts and loans from people who were starting to make threats about collection. Cassidy had promised Dorothy that once she married Ethan and gained access to what she believed was his substantial inheritance, she would give Dorothy $50,000 to help clear her debts. All Dorothy had to do in return was provide information about our family's assets and support Cassidy's version of events to anyone who asked. The conspiracy that had been working against me was far more organized than I had imagined. Dorothy revealed that she had told Cassidy extensive details about Thomas' estate, about the properties I had inherited, about investments and accounts that were supposed to be private family matters. Cassidy did not know yet specifically which properties were mine, but Dorothy had confirmed that I owned multiple pieces of real estate in the downtown area. Cassidy was actively working to identify each property, to map out exactly what assets might eventually flow to Ethan. Dorothy seemed completely oblivious to how deeply she had betrayed me. She actually seemed to believe she was doing the right thing, that I was hoarding wealth that should be shared with my children immediately, that Ethan deserved to know the full extent of what he stood to inherit. She said with genuine conviction that Cassidy was just looking out for Ethan's future, and that I should be grateful he had found such a smart, ambitious partner. The legal threat arrived 3 days later in the form of a certified letter delivered to my home by a courier. The letter, written on the letterhead of a law firm I had never heard of, accused me of parental alienation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It claimed that I had engaged in a campaign to destroy my son's relationship through lies, manipulation, and invasion of privacy. The letter demanded that I sign a legally binding statement promising not to interfere in any way with Ethan and Cassidy's marriage, that I would make no negative statements about Cassidy to any family members, and that I would publicly apologize for my behavior at the wedding ceremony. If I refused to sign, the letter threatened, Cassidy would pursue legal action and would ensure that Ethan severed all contact with me permanently. I read that letter 3 times, each reading making me feel more hopeless and defeated. I showed it to Helen, and she immediately recognized that the law firm was barely legitimate, that the legal claims were nonsense. But that did not matter. The threat was not really about winning a lawsuit. The threat was about forcing my compliance and ensuring my silence. I have never felt as alone and defeated as I did that night, sitting in my house, surrounded by the life Thomas and I had built together. I had lost my son to a manipulative woman who was playing a long game I had not fully understood. My own sister had betrayed me for money. Half my family believed lies about me. I was being legally threatened, and the wedding was just days away. An event where I would be marginalized and humiliated while watching my son make the biggest mistake of his life. I sat on my bedroom floor at 2 a.m, crying so hard I could barely breathe, and I honestly considered just giving up entirely. Maybe I should sign whatever they wanted me to sign. Maybe I should just accept that I had lost this battle. Maybe staying in Ethan's life, in any capacity, was better than losing him completely, even if it meant swallowing my pride and living with lies. But Helen found me in that state the next morning. She had a key to my house and let herself in when I did not answer her calls. She found me still on the bedroom floor, exhausted from crying, and she sat down beside me with the fierce determination of a true friend. She told me in no uncertain terms that I was not allowed to give up, that giving in to manipulation only encourages more manipulation, that I had to fight for my son, even if he could not see right now that he needed fighting for. She made me coffee, she made me eat something, and then she made me listen as she laid out a plan. We needed to stop playing defense and start gathering our own evidence. We needed allies who could not be swayed by Cassidy's charm. And most importantly, we needed patience. Because manipulators like Cassidy always eventually reveal their true nature. We just had to be ready to document it when she did. The phone call from David at Sterling Management came that same afternoon and provided the first ray of hope I had felt in weeks. David said he needed to speak with me urgently about a development with the tenants at the Maple Street property. When I called him back, he told me something that changed everything. He had been at the house the previous week for a routine quarterly inspection. And while he was there checking the furnace in the basement, he overheard a conversation between Cassidy and another woman upstairs in the kitchen. They did not know he was in the house. He heard Cassidy say clearly that she was getting close to figuring out who really owned the property, that she had narrowed it down to 3 possible LLC owners, and that once she knew for sure, she would have leverage to get what she wanted. David said the coldness in her voice, the calculated nature of the conversation, made him deeply uncomfortable. He was calling me not just as a property manager, but as someone who was genuinely worried about what this tenant was planning. I thanked him with tears in my eyes and asked if he would be willing to help me document any future concerning behavior. He agreed immediately and said that in all his years in this business, he had never encountered a tenant quite like Cassidy Monroe, and whatever I was dealing with, I should be very careful. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect blue skies and warm sunshine, the kind of day that seemed to mock the dread sitting heavy in my chest. I dressed carefully in the pale blue dress I had chosen months ago when I still believed I would have a meaningful role in this ceremony. Helen arrived at my house to drive with me to the venue, an elegant garden estate on the outskirts of town with manicured lawns and flower gardens in full bloom. As we pulled into the parking area, I could see the white chairs arranged in neat rows facing an arbor covered in roses and ivy. Guests were already arriving, women in colorful dresses and men in dark suits, everyone smiling and laughing with the easy joy of people attending a celebration. I felt completely disconnected from their happiness, like I was watching the scene through thick glass that separated me from the real world. Helen and I walked to the entrance where a young woman with a clipboard was checking names and directing guests to their seats. She found my name on her list, gave me a bright professional smile, and told me I was seated in row 12 on the groom's side. Row 12. I stood there for a moment, letting that sink in. The mother of the groom was being seated in row 12, so far back I would barely be able to see my own son's face during the ceremony. Meanwhile, I watched as Cassidy's relatives were escorted to the front rows, treated with the deference usually reserved for immediate family. Helen squeezed my arm and whispered that we should just get through this, that causing a scene would only play into Cassidy's hands. So I walked with as much dignity as I could muster to row 12 and sat down between Helen and a cousin I had not spoken to in 5 years. surrounded by distant relatives and family friends who clearly had no idea where I should have been sitting. The ceremony itself was beautiful in all the ways that made my heart ache. Ethan stood at the altar looking handsome in his dark gray suit, his hair freshly cut, his face radiant with happiness as he watched Cassidy walk down the aisle on her father's arm. She was stunning in a lace gown that must have cost thousands of dollars, her dark hair swept up elegantly, a veil trailing behind her like something from a fairy tale. I watched my son's face as he saw her approaching, and the pure love in his eyes made me want to weep because I knew with absolute certainty that she did not feel the same way about him. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and partnership, and I had to bite my lip to keep from standing up and screaming the truth that this woman marrying my son was a calculating predator who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. But the real humiliation came during what Cassidy had described in the program as a family unity ritual. After the vows and rings had been exchanged, the officiant invited the parents to come forward for a candle-lighting ceremony meant to symbolize the joining of two families. Cassidy's parents walked proudly to the front, each taking a lit taper and saying a few words about their daughter and their joy in welcoming Ethan into their family. Then Ethan's father was mentioned, and there was a moment of silence for Thomas, who had passed away. And then nothing. The officiant moved on to the next part of the ceremony. I sat frozen in my seat in row 12, realizing with dawning horror that I was not going to be called forward at all. I had been deliberately excluded from this ritual. Patricia, sitting several rows ahead of me, turned around with shock and anger written clearly on her face. Other guests began to notice and whisper. The humiliation was complete and public. Cassidy had managed to erase me from my own son's wedding ceremony in front of everyone we knew, and Ethan either had not noticed or had allowed it to happen. The reception was held in a large white tent on the property's lawn, with round tables covered in cream linens and elaborate centerpieces of roses and hydrangeas. A string quartet played softly as guests found their assigned seats for dinner. I located my name card and discovered I had been placed at a table in the far corner of the tent with cousins I barely knew, people who had probably been invited out of obligation and who had no real connection to Ethan's life. Helen had been seated at a completely different table, clearly an intentional move to isolate me from my only real ally in the room. Meanwhile, Dorothy sat at the head table with the bride and groom and the wedding party, laughing and talking animatedly with Cassidy's sisters, fully embracing her role as the betrayer who had chosen the winning side. The mother-son dance that traditionally follows the first dance between bride and groom was another carefully orchestrated sleight. Cassidy and her father took to the dance floor for an elaborate choreographed routine that brought tears and applause from the guests. Then, several other traditional dances were announced: bride and father-in-law, groom and mother-in-law, but there was no dance for mother and son. Ethan never even looked in my direction. I sat at my distant table feeling invisible, feeling erased, watching my son celebrate the happiest day of his life while treating me like I did not exist. I kept thinking about all the moments I had imagined over the years, how I had pictured dancing with Ethan at his wedding, how I had imagined feeling proud and happy and welcoming a daughter into our family. This nightmare was so far from those dreams that it felt surreal. Helen had not been idle despite being separated from me. She had been watching Cassidy carefully all evening, and during the cocktail hour before dinner, she managed to strike up a conversation with a young woman named Jennifer, who introduced herself as Cassidy's college roommate. Jennifer had been drinking heavily, and alcohol had loosened her tongue considerably. Helen, with her natural warmth and gift for getting people to talk, asked innocent questions about how Jennifer knew the bride, how long they had been friends. Jennifer started sharing stories about their college years, and the more she drank, the more revealing those stories became. She talked about how Cassidy had always been ambitious, how she used to study the social scene like it was an academic subject, how she would identify guys from wealthy families and pursue them strategically. Jennifer laughed as she said this, like it was an amusing character quirk rather than a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior. The real bombshell came when Helen asked if Cassidy had always wanted to get married young. Jennifer's face took on a strange expression, something between admiration and discomfort, and she said that Cassidy did not care about marriage itself. She cared about security and access to resources. Jennifer revealed that Cassidy had explicitly told her the plan was to find someone with family money, get married, get pregnant quickly to lock things in, stay married long enough to establish financial claims, and then divorce, and take half of everything. Jennifer said that Cassidy had studied Ethan's family extensively before deciding he was the right target, that she knew about the properties and investments, that she had actually bragged to Jennifer about how she had isolated Ethan from his mother because the mother was the main obstacle to accessing the family wealth. Helen recorded this entire conversation on her phone, pretending to check messages while the voice recorder app captured every damaging word. But what Helen overheard next was even worse. Late in the evening, after most guests had moved to the dance floor or the bar, Helen went to use the restroom in the main house. As she approached the ladies' room, she heard voices inside and recognized one of them as Cassidy's. Helen stood outside the door, her phone recording, as Cassidy talked to Dorothy. Cassidy was saying with cold calculation that once they returned from the honeymoon, they needed to find out which properties downtown belonged to Margaret. Dorothy said something Helen could not quite hear, and then Cassidy responded clearly that once they knew what Margaret owned, they would apply pressure. Ethan would be instructed to demand his inheritance early, and if Margaret refused, Ethan would be convinced to cut her off entirely. Cassidy said with absolute confidence that Margaret would give them anything to maintain contact with her son, that manipulating someone's love for their child was the easiest leverage in the world. Dorothy asked what would happen if Margaret still refused, and Cassidy laughed and said, then they would make sure Ethan never spoke to his mother again. And eventually Margaret would die and Ethan would inherit everything anyway. So either way they won. Helen stood outside that bathroom door with her hands shaking, her phone recording words that revealed the depth of evil she was dealing with. She waited until Cassidy and Dorothy left, then found me immediately and pulled me outside into the garden where we could talk privately. She played me the recording, and I listened to Cassidy's cold voice discussing my destruction like it was a business transaction. I felt something shift inside me in that moment. The sadness and defeat I had been carrying transformed into something harder and more determined. This woman was not just manipulating my son for money, she was actively planning to isolate him, to use his love for me as a weapon, to destroy our family for financial gain. I looked at Helen and said that we were done playing defense. We were done trying to be reasonable with someone who had no intention of being reasonable back. When Ethan returned from his honeymoon in 2 weeks, we would be ready with evidence that even he could not ignore. The evening ended with Ethan and Cassidy leaving in a shower of rose petals and sparklers, heading off to spend their wedding night at a luxury hotel before flying to Bali the next day for a 2-week honeymoon. I watched them drive away in the decorated car, watched my son smile and wave at the cheering guests, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was not over. This battle had been brutal and I had lost many rounds, but the war was not finished. Cassidy had overplayed her hand by revealing her true nature to Helen. She had gotten so confident in her victory that she had stopped being careful about what she said and who might overhear. That arrogance was going to be her downfall, and I was going to make absolutely certain that my son saw her for exactly what she was before she could destroy him completely. The 2 weeks, while Ethan and Cassidy were on their honeymoon in Bali, were the most strategically important 14 days of this entire nightmare. I was no longer the passive victim being manipulated and humiliated. I was a mother fighting for her son with the focused determination of someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Helen practically moved into my house, and we converted my dining room into a war room with documents, recordings, timelines, and evidence spread across every surface. My lawyer, Franklin Morse, a sharp 60-year-old man who had handled Thomas' estate and whom I trusted completely, came to review everything we had gathered. He sat at my dining room table for 3 hours, reading through documents, listening to recordings, making notes in his precise handwriting, and when he finally looked up at me, he said with complete confidence that we had enough to show Ethan the truth, but we needed to be strategic about how we presented it. David from Sterling Management proved to be an invaluable ally in ways I had not anticipated. He called me 2 days after the wedding with information that changed my entire understanding of how long Cassidy had been planning this. David had gone through the property management files carefully and discovered that Cassidy had been making inquiries about Riverside Properties LLC for over 18 months, long before she had ever mentioned renovations or contacted me as Mrs. Riverside. She had been systematically trying to uncover the ownership structure almost from the moment she moved into the house with Ethan. She had asked to see lease agreements, requested copies of property tax documents under the guise of needing them for rental verification, even tried to charm the office assistant into revealing confidential information about the LLC's other holdings. David had kept notes on all of this because it struck him as unusual, and now those notes formed a clear timeline of premeditated investigation. Even more damning, David revealed that he had deliberately fed Cassidy false information when she pressed him. He told her that Riverside Properties was owned by an out-of-state investment group based in Delaware, which sent her and her private investigator on a wild goose chase that bought us time and kept her from discovering the truth. Dorothy's gambling debts became an unexpected point of leverage. Franklin did some discreet investigation and discovered that my sister owed money not just to casinos, but to several very unsavory individuals who were starting to make threats about collection. The total had grown to $95,000 with interest and penalties. Cassidy had promised Dorothy $50,000 to help clear these debts, but Franklin's contacts revealed that Cassidy had never had any intention of actually paying. She had been stringing Dorothy along with promises, using her for information and support, with no plans to follow through once she had what she needed. Franklin suggested that we could use this information to flip Dorothy, to make her realize she had been played just like everyone else. If Dorothy understood that Cassidy had used her and was going to abandon her to the loan sharks, she might be willing to testify about everything she knew regarding Cassidy's plans and statements. The most important ally came from within my own family when Patricia, Ethan's older sister, finally saw the truth she had been willfully ignoring. Patricia had stayed at her house watching Ethan's iPad for him while he was on his honeymoon, as he had asked her to check his work emails periodically in case anything urgent came up. She was checking his email when a text message notification popped up on the screen. It was from Cassidy, sent to Dorothy, and the message preview was visible enough to make Patricia curious. She knew she was invading her brother's privacy, but something made her open the full message thread between Cassidy and Dorothy, and what she found there made her physically ill. There were hundreds of messages going back months. Messages where Cassidy discussed Ethan like he was a mark in a con. Messages about manipulating him. Messages about the real estate strategy. Messages where Cassidy said cruel things about Ethan's appearance and personality and intelligence. In one message, Cassidy told Dorothy that Ethan was not particularly bright or attractive, but he was malleable and came from money, which made him perfect for her purposes. Patricia called me sobbing so hard she could barely speak. She said she was sorry over and over, that she had accused me of being jealous and controlling when I was just trying to protect Ethan, that she should have listened to me from the beginning. I told her there was no time for apologies now. We had to focus on helping Ethan before Cassidy destroyed him completely. Patricia came to my house immediately and spent hours with Helen and Franklin and me, going through everything we had compiled. She photographed every text message on Ethan's iPad, creating a complete digital record of the conversations between Cassidy and Dorothy. Some of the messages were so cold and calculated that reading them made my stomach turn. In one exchange, Dorothy asked if Cassidy actually loved Ethan at all, and Cassidy responded that love was a fairy tale for stupid people, that marriage was a business transaction, and anyone who thought differently was naive. She said Ethan served his purpose, which was providing access to family assets. And once she had secured her position and had a child to guarantee ongoing financial support, what she felt about him personally was completely irrelevant. The final piece of crucial evidence came from an unexpected source. Helen had reached out to Richard, Cassidy's ex-husband, and convinced him to fly in from Boston to speak with us. Richard arrived at my house on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, looking tired and wary but also determined. He said that when his marriage to Cassidy fell apart and she took him for everything he had, he promised himself that if he ever had a chance to prevent her from doing it to someone else, he would take it. Richard spent 2 hours telling us his story in painful detail. He explained how Cassidy had targeted him specifically because his family had money, how she had isolated him from his parents by creating conflicts and accusations, how she had manipulated situations to make him look like the bad guy, how she had fabricated abuse allegations when he finally started to see through her and wanted a divorce. He had court documents, text messages, sworn statements from the divorce proceedings that showed a pattern of behavior identical to what she was doing to Ethan. Richard agreed to provide testimony, to meet with Ethan personally, to do whatever was necessary to prevent another man from going through what he had experienced. During these 2 weeks of preparation, Cassidy made several mistakes that revealed just how overconfident she had become. She returned from the honeymoon one day early without telling anyone, and David happened to be at the Maple Street property doing a routine check when she arrived. He heard her on the phone with someone, likely her private investigator, discussing her theory that Margaret might be connected to Riverside Properties after all. She was saying that the timing of the property purchase matched up with when Thomas died, that the rental rate was suspiciously affordable, that there were too many coincidences. She said she was going to force a meeting with Mrs. Riverside in person, that she would figure out the connection one way or another. David called me immediately, and Franklin smiled when I told him. He said that Cassidy pushing for an in-person meeting was exactly what we needed, that it would give us the opportunity to control the situation and document her behavior in a setting we could orchestrate. Franklin laid out the final strategy with the precision of a chess master planning moves several steps ahead. We would agree to Cassidy's demand for a face-to-face meeting between her and Mrs. Riverside. I would attend that meeting in disguise, dressed differently than Cassidy had ever seen me, wearing a wig and glasses, using a slightly different voice. Patricia and Helen would be present but hidden, recording everything that happened. We would let Cassidy talk, let her make her demands, let her reveal her true nature and intentions on camera. Then, at the strategic moment, I would reveal my identity and confront her with everything we knew. The key was that Ethan had to be there to witness it himself, to see and hear his wife's manipulation with his own eyes and ears. No amount of evidence presented secondhand would have the impact of watching her mask slip in real time. Franklin said we would have one chance to do this right, and we could not afford to make mistakes because if we failed, Cassidy would know we were on to her, and she would adapt her strategy accordingly. The message to Cassidy as Mrs. Riverside went out 1 week after she returned from her honeymoon. David called her on my behalf and said that the property owner had reviewed her complaints and renovation requests and was willing to meet in person to discuss the situation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock at the Maple Street property. Cassidy was told she could bring her husband to the meeting. David reported that Cassidy sounded triumphant on the phone, confident that she was finally going to get what she wanted. I spent the days before that meeting, preparing myself mentally and emotionally for what was coming. I practiced my disguise, rehearsed how I would speak and carry myself as a different person, and tried to steel myself for the moment when I would have to watch my son's heart break as he realized what his wife truly was. Helen held my hand the night before and told me I was doing the right thing, that short-term pain was better than long-term destruction, that Ethan would eventually thank me even if he hated me at first. I wanted desperately to believe her. Saturday afternoon arrived with heavy gray clouds that threatened rain, appropriate weather for what was about to unfold. I dressed carefully in clothes Cassidy had never seen me wear, a conservative navy suit that made me look like a businesswoman rather than a mother. Helen helped me with the wig, a shorter blonde style, completely different from my own shoulder-length brown hair, and the glasses with plain lenses that changed the shape of my face. I practiced my voice, making it slightly deeper and more formal, stripping away the warmth that usually characterized how I spoke. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Patricia and Helen would arrive at the house 30 minutes early to set up hidden cameras in the living room where the meeting would take place. David would let them in and make sure everything was positioned correctly. Franklin would be parked down the street, ready to arrive within minutes if needed. Everyone had their role to play in this carefully orchestrated confrontation. I arrived at the Maple Street house at exactly 2 o'clock and parked on the street rather than in the driveway. My hands were shaking as I gathered my briefcase of property documents, but I forced myself to breathe slowly and stay calm. David met me at the door and whispered that Cassidy and Ethan were already in the living room waiting, that Patricia and Helen were hidden in the study with the camera equipment, that everything was ready. I nodded, straightened my shoulders, and walked into the living room as Mrs. Riverside, property owner and anonymous landlord. Ethan was sitting on the couch looking uncomfortable in khaki pants and a button-down shirt, clearly dressed up for this meeting. Cassidy sat beside him wearing a beautiful cream-colored dress and heels, her hair and makeup perfect, every inch the elegant young wife. She stood to greet me with a bright smile and extended hand, and I shook it while looking carefully at her face for any sign that she recognized me. There was nothing, just professional courtesy and calculated charm. Cassidy began the meeting by thanking Mrs. Riverside for taking the time to meet with them personally. She said they had been such happy tenants for over 4 years, that they loved the house and wanted to make it their permanent home. She presented her renovation proposal again, this time with even more elaborate plans and higher cost estimates. She had clearly spent the honeymoon preparing this presentation because it was polished and professional, with architectural drawings and contractor bids, and a financial analysis showing how much the renovations would increase the property value. She argued that it was a win-win situation, that they were willing to sign a longer lease and even discuss a rent increase in exchange for the landlord funding these improvements. Ethan nodded along with everything she said, occasionally adding comments about how much they loved the neighborhood and the house. My heart ached watching him, seeing how completely he believed in this marriage and this future she was describing. The moment that changed everything came when I, still in disguise as Mrs. Riverside, asked them to tell me more about their long-term plans for the property. Cassidy's face lit up, and she launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. She said they were planning to start a family soon, that they wanted to raise children in this house, that stability and security were so important to them. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that Ethan came from a family with substantial real estate holdings in the area, that his mother owned multiple properties but was not very supportive of their relationship. She said with perfectly crafted sadness that family dynamics were complicated, that Ethan's mother was jealous of their marriage, but they were trying to build their own life despite the obstacles. I watched Ethan's face as she said this, and he looked down at his hands with an expression of genuine pain. She had convinced him that I was the villain in his life story, and watching that realization made me almost lose my composure. Dorothy's arrival was unexpected, and threw our carefully laid plans into temporary chaos. Cassidy had invited her to the meeting without telling David or anyone else, and she walked in through the kitchen door like she owned the place. She was already slightly drunk even though it was early afternoon, carrying a flask in her oversized purse. Dorothy sat down heavily in the armchair and said to me as Mrs. Riverside that it was about time the landlord took this meeting seriously, that these kids deserved better than they had been getting. I could see concern flash across Ethan's face at his aunt's condition, but Cassidy smiled at Dorothy like everything was fine. Dorothy started rambling about family and responsibility and how people with money had an obligation to help their relatives. She looked directly at me without any recognition whatsoever and said that Ethan's mother Margaret was wealthy and owned property all over downtown, but was too selfish to help her own son, that it was shameful how she hoarded her assets. The conversation took a sharp turn when I asked, still disguised as Mrs. Riverside, what they knew about the ownership structure of this particular property. Cassidy's eyes sharpened with interest, and she said that she had been trying to find out more details about Riverside Properties LLC for quite some time. She admitted openly that she had hired someone to research the company because she believed in being informed about who she was doing business with. She listed several addresses of other properties downtown, asking if those also belonged to Riverside Properties, and my blood ran cold because 2 of the addresses she mentioned were indeed properties I owned under different LLC names. She had been investigating far more thoroughly than I had realized. Cassidy said with a calculating smile that she had a theory that there might be family connections involved in this LLC, that the pieces seemed to fit together in interesting ways. I asked what she meant by that, and she glanced at Ethan before saying that she believed Margaret, Ethan's mother, might have some involvement with Riverside Properties, though she had not been able to prove it yet. That was when Ethan spoke up for the first time with real emotion in his voice. He looked at Cassidy and asked why she had been researching his mother's properties so extensively, why she seemed to know so much about assets that were not really their business. Cassidy immediately shifted into soothing mode, reaching for his hand and explaining that she was just trying to understand their future prospects, that she wanted to know what they might eventually inherit so they could plan accordingly. But there was something in Ethan's face, a flicker of doubt, a moment where the spell seemed to crack slightly. He said that it felt strange to him, that she seemed almost obsessed with his family's money, that it made him uncomfortable. Cassidy's smile tightened, and I could see her calculating how to regain control of the situation. Dorothy's drunken mistake happened next, and accelerated everything beyond what we had planned. She pulled out her flask, took a long drink despite Cassidy's warning look, and said loudly that they should just tell Mrs. Riverside the truth. She said they knew this mysterious landlord was probably connected to the Whitfield estate somehow, that they were not stupid, that Cassidy had figured it all out. Cassidy shot Dorothy a look of pure fury, but the damage was done. Ethan turned to his wife and asked what Dorothy was talking about. What exactly had Cassidy figured out? The room went silent except for Dorothy's heavy breathing and the sound of rain that had finally started falling outside. I could not wait any longer for the perfect moment. I reached up and removed the blonde wig, then took off the glasses. Ethan's face went completely white. He whispered, "Mom," like he could not believe what he was seeing. I said clearly and calmly that yes, I was Margaret, and I was also Mrs. Riverside, and I had owned this house for 5 years. I had bought it to give him stability and security, to provide him with a beautiful home without him feeling indebted to me. I had kept it secret because I wanted him to maintain his independence, but I had never imagined that my attempt to protect and help my son would be manipulated by someone with ulterior motives. Ethan just stared at me with his mouth open, his brain trying to process this information. He looked at Cassidy, then back at me, then at Dorothy, then back at Cassidy again. Cassidy's mask slipped, and it was terrifying to watch. The warm, loving wife disappeared like she had never existed, replaced by someone cold and calculating and furious. She stood up and pointed at me, her voice rising as she accused me of being sick and twisted, of spying on them like some kind of stalker, of being a controlling, manipulative mother who could not let her son have his own life. She turned to Ethan with tears that I knew were entirely manufactured and said that this proved everything she had been telling him, that his mother was dangerous and obsessed. She said, "What kind of person lies for 5 years? What kind of mother plays these sick games with her own child?" She told Ethan they needed to leave immediately, that they needed to get away from this toxic woman before she destroyed them completely. But Ethan did not move. He sat on the couch looking between his wife and his mother with an expression of complete confusion and pain. He said quietly that he did not understand, that none of this made sense, that someone needed to explain what was really happening because he felt like he was losing his mind. I opened my mouth to speak, but Patricia and Helen walked into the room at that moment, and Patricia was holding her phone. She said that before Ethan made any decisions, there was something he needed to see. Cassidy's face drained of color when she saw Patricia. She demanded to know what Patricia was doing here, but Patricia ignored her completely. She walked over to her brother, sat down beside him on the couch, and began showing him the screenshots she had taken from his own iPad, the text messages between Cassidy and Dorothy discussing him like he was a business transaction rather than a human being. I watched my son's face as he read message after message, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands start to shake, watched the moment when understanding and heartbreak crashed over him like a wave. Cassidy lunged for the phone, trying to grab it away from him, claiming the messages were taken out of context, that Patricia had manipulated them somehow, that this was all a setup. But Ethan pulled away from her and kept reading. He read the message where Cassidy told Dorothy he was not particularly bright. He read the message where she discussed getting pregnant quickly to lock in financial claims. He read the message where Dorothy asked if she loved him, and Cassidy responded that love was irrelevant to the transaction. The room was silent except for the rain hammering against the windows. Ethan finally looked up at his wife, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He asked if any of it had been real, if she had ever loved him at all, or if everything had been a lie from the very beginning. Cassidy tried one more time to manipulate the situation. She started crying, saying that everyone was ganging up on her, that his family had hated her from the start, that of course she loved him but his mother had poisoned everyone against her. But something fundamental had shifted in Ethan. The spell was broken. He stood up and asked her a direct question. He asked if she was pregnant like she had claimed, if there was actually a baby, or if that had been a lie too. Cassidy's face went blank for just a moment, and in that moment Ethan knew the truth. He said he wanted to see medical records, Proof of the pregnancy. Right now. When Cassidy hesitated, he pulled out his own phone and called her obstetrician's office. The receptionist confirmed after checking records that Cassidy had not been seen in their office in over 8 months, that there was no current pregnancy on file. Cassidy's final play was desperation and rage. She screamed at Ethan that he was pathetic, that she had wasted years of her life on him, that his family was not even worth what she had thought they were worth. She said his mother was holding out on him, hiding money that should be his, and he was too weak to demand what he deserved. The mask had completely fallen away, and the person standing in that living room was someone Ethan had never really known. He looked at her like she was a stranger, which in many ways she was. And he said very quietly that he wanted a divorce, that she needed to get out of this house immediately. Cassidy refused, saying she had rights, that this was legally her home too. That was when Franklin walked in, briefcase in hand, and informed her that as of this moment, she was being served with an eviction notice based on multiple lease violations, including non-payment of rent, filing false housing complaints, and threatening property damage. All documented extensively. She had 24 hours to remove her belongings or face criminal charges. The 24 hours following that catastrophic confrontation were among the most intense and emotionally draining of my entire life. Ethan left the house immediately after Cassidy's mask fully dropped, walking out into the rain without even a jacket, and I found him sitting in his car in the driveway with his head resting on the steering wheel. I approached carefully, knocked gently on his window, and when he looked up at me, his face was devastated in a way that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. He rolled down the window, and I stood there in the rain, water soaking through my clothes, and I asked if he was okay, even though I knew it was a foolish question. He said he did not know what was real anymore, that everything he thought he knew about his life for the past 5 years had been built on lies, and he did not know how to process any of it. I told him he could come stay with me, that he needed to be somewhere safe while he figured things out, and after a long moment he nodded. Patricia took charge of the practical aspects of extracting Ethan from the situation. She went back into the house and packed bags of his clothes and essential items, while Cassidy screamed threats and accusations from the living room. David changed the locks on all the doors and explained to Cassidy that she was no longer a legal tenant, that any attempt to enter the property after the 24-hour grace period would result in a call to the police for trespassing. Cassidy called her own lawyer, some young attorney who clearly did not understand what he was walking into, and there was a tense standoff in my driveway where Franklin methodically destroyed every argument the other lawyer tried to make. Franklin had documentation of everything, every lease violation, every false complaint, every withheld rent payment, and he made it crystal clear that Cassidy had no legal leg to stand on. If she left peacefully within 24 hours, no criminal charges would be filed. If she fought this, he would prosecute her to the fullest extent of the law, and her lies would become public record in court proceedings. The evidence that Patricia had gathered from Ethan's iPad proved to be even more damaging than we had initially realized. When Patricia showed everything to Franklin, he discovered that the text messages between Cassidy and Dorothy included explicit discussions about forging documents, creating false paper trails, and potentially even attempting identity theft to access accounts. Cassidy had written to Dorothy about obtaining power of attorney documents and getting Ethan to sign them under false pretenses, claiming they were just standard marriage paperwork. This crossed the line from manipulation into criminal fraud, and Franklin immediately took this evidence to a prosecutor he knew in the district attorney's office. The prosecutor was very interested in the case, particularly the pattern of behavior when combined with testimony from Richard about the identical schemes in her previous marriage. Dorothy's role in the conspiracy unraveled rapidly once she realized that Cassidy had never intended to pay her the promised $50,000 and that she was now facing potential legal consequences for her participation. Franklin met with Dorothy and her own attorney, a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the situation, and he offered her a deal. If Dorothy provided a full confession, detailed testimony about everything Cassidy had planned and said, and agreed to enter a treatment program for her gambling addiction, Franklin would help negotiate a settlement for her debts and recommend no criminal charges be filed against her. Dorothy, faced with the choice between loyalty to Cassidy, who had used her, or cooperation that might save her from financial and legal ruin, chose self-preservation. She signed an affidavit detailing every conversation, every scheme, every manipulation that Cassidy had discussed with her over the past year. Some of the revelations in that affidavit made me physically ill, including Cassidy's plan to eventually claim elder abuse against me to take control of my assets through legal guardianship proceedings. Richard's arrival and his meeting with Ethan was perhaps the most impactful element in cementing my son's understanding of what he had been dealing with. Richard came to my house 2 days after the confrontation, and he and Ethan sat in my kitchen for over 3 hours while Richard told his story in excruciating detail. He showed Ethan court documents from his divorce, including the fabricated abuse allegations, the false police reports, the manipulated evidence that Cassidy had used to paint him as dangerous. He showed Ethan bank statements demonstrating how she had drained their joint accounts, credit card bills showing purchases she made while claiming they needed to be frugal, and text messages from before their divorce that showed the same calculating coldness that Ethan had just discovered. Richard told Ethan that recognizing you have been manipulated does not make you stupid or weak, it makes you human, because people like Cassidy are experts at exploiting normal human emotions like love and trust. The two men formed a bond that day, united by their shared experience of being targeted by the same predator. The house situation reached its crisis point when the 24-hour deadline expired and Cassidy refused to leave. She had barricaded herself in the master bedroom and was posting on social media about being illegally evicted by her abusive husband and controlling mother-in-law. She called the police, claiming domestic violence, and when 2 officers arrived, they found a very complex situation that required several hours to sort out. Fortunately, Franklin had anticipated this and had all the legal documentation ready, including the eviction notice, the lease violations, the property ownership records, and even the recordings from the confrontation meeting. The officers reviewed everything carefully, spoke to Cassidy, spoke to David, the property manager, and ultimately informed Cassidy that she had no legal right to remain in the property and needed to leave immediately, or she would be arrested for trespassing and making false reports. Cassidy's departure was dramatic and ugly. She threw things and screamed obscenities and threatened lawsuits against everyone involved. She claimed she was pregnant with Ethan's child, then changed her story and claimed she had miscarried from the stress, then admitted there had never been a pregnancy, but said it was justified manipulation because Ethan needed motivation to grow up. She packed her belongings hastily, leaving the house in chaos with closet doors hanging open and drawers emptied onto the floor. She took items that did not belong to her, including some of Ethan's electronics and family photographs, which would later become additional evidence against her. As she loaded her car, she turned to where I was standing with Helen and Patricia and said with pure venom in her voice that this was not over, that she would make sure I regretted interfering in her life. Helen calmly held up her phone and said that threat had been recorded and would be added to the file. Cassidy got in her car and drove away, and I felt a wave of relief so intense I almost collapsed. The annulment proceedings moved forward quickly due to the unique circumstances of the case. Ethan filed for annulment rather than divorce based on fraud, arguing that the marriage had been entered into under false pretenses with Cassidy, concealing material facts about her intentions and history. Franklin presented the court with an overwhelming amount of evidence, including Dorothy's affidavit, Richard's testimony, the text message records, the recordings from the confrontation, and documentation of the fabricated pregnancy. The judge reviewed the case materials and agreed that this was indeed a marriage based on fraudulent representations. Less than 3 months after the wedding, the marriage was legally annulled, meaning it was as if it had never existed in the first place. Cassidy contested the annulment and tried to claim community property rights, but her own lawyer eventually advised her to accept the judgment because fighting it would only expose her to greater legal liability and potential criminal charges. The criminal investigation into Cassidy's activities was opened based on the evidence of attempted fraud, identity theft planning, and making false reports to authorities. The prosecutor built a case that included her previous divorce and Richard's testimony demonstrating a pattern of criminal behavior across multiple relationships. Cassidy hired an expensive criminal defense attorney, presumably using money she had extracted from Richard in their divorce, and her lawyer negotiated a plea agreement. Cassidy pleaded guilty to reduced charges of filing false reports and attempted fraud, receiving probation and a suspended jail sentence contingent on her leaving the state and having no contact with our family. We learned later that she had already moved to Arizona, and there were disturbing rumors that she had begun dating another man from a wealthy family. I tried to warn him through indirect channels, but I do not know if he ever received the message. The reconciliation between Ethan and me was slow and painful, but ultimately healing. He came to live with me for 2 months after the annulment was finalized, and we spent many evenings sitting in my kitchen talking about everything that had happened. He apologized repeatedly for not believing me, for letting Cassidy isolate him from his family, for being blind to what she was doing. I told him over and over that he had nothing to apologize for, that he had loved someone and trusted someone, and those are not character flaws even when the person proves to be unworthy of that love and trust. We both cried a lot during those weeks, mourning the loss of what he thought his marriage was, processing the betrayal and manipulation, rebuilding the trust between us that Cassidy had worked so hard to destroy. Patricia was an enormous help during this time, organizing family dinners and creating opportunities for healing. Even Dorothy, after completing a rehabilitation program for her gambling addiction, began attending family gatherings again, appropriately humbled and genuinely remorseful for her role in the disaster. 3 months after the annulment became final, life had settled into a new kind of normal that felt both familiar and completely different from anything we had known before. Ethan moved out of my house and into a small apartment across town, a place that was his own and not tied to any painful memories. He refused my offer to cover his rent, insisting that he needed to rebuild his sense of independence and self-reliance. I understood that need completely and supported his decision. I sold the Victorian house on Maple Street to a lovely young couple who were expecting their first child, and I felt a sense of closure watching them sign the papers and talk excitedly about their future there. The house that had been the center of so much manipulation and pain would now hopefully be filled with genuine love and happiness. The healing in our family continued in unexpected ways. Patricia and I became closer than we had been in years, bonded by our shared experience of fighting for Ethan and witnessing how dangerous emotional manipulation can be. Patricia started volunteering with an organization that helped people recognize abusive relationships, using her experience to help others see warning signs earlier than we had. Dorothy completed 6 months of intensive treatment for her gambling addiction and attended weekly meetings to maintain her recovery. She moved to a small apartment within her means, took a job at a local library, and began the long process of rebuilding trust with the family. I helped her negotiate settlements with her creditors and made sure she had the support she needed to stay clean. Our relationship would never be what it was before her betrayal. But there was hope for a different kind of connection built on honesty about our flaws and failures. Ethan's journey of healing was the most important to me, and also the most difficult to watch. He started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and manipulation, and through those sessions, he began to understand the sophisticated psychological techniques that Cassidy had used to control him. He learned about isolation tactics, about how manipulators gradually separate their victims from support systems, about love bombing and intermittent reinforcement and gaslighting. Understanding that what happened to him was not unique, that there were actual documented patterns to this kind of abuse, helped him stop blaming himself for falling for it. He read books about emotional manipulation, talked to Richard regularly for support, and slowly began to rebuild his confidence and sense of judgment. He went back to school to get a master's degree in design, something he had put off because Cassidy had told him it was impractical. About 6 months after the annulment, he started cautiously dating again, and I watched with relief as he showed much healthier boundaries and awareness in these new relationships. My own reflection on this entire nightmare led me to some uncomfortable truths about my choices and motivations. Had buying the house secretly been the right decision? In some ways, yes, because it had protected Ethan financially from much worse damage than ultimately occurred. But in other ways, the secrecy had created distance and distrust that made it easier for Cassidy to paint me as the villain. I realized that I could have been more open about wanting to help my children while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. I learned that protecting someone you love sometimes means letting them make mistakes and being ready to help them recover, not trying to control situations so they never get hurt in the first place. Franklin pointed out that if I had not owned the house, Cassidy would have found other ways to manipulate the situation, and I needed to stop second-guessing a decision that had ultimately come from a place of love, even if the execution was imperfect. The lessons about manipulation and predatory behavior extended beyond our family. I began speaking at community groups about financial elder abuse and how to recognize when someone is being isolated and controlled. I shared my story, with Ethan's permission, to help other mothers understand the warning signs of a manipulative person entering their child's life. The response was overwhelming. So many people contacted me afterward to share their own stories of family members who had been targeted by con artists, gold diggers, and emotional manipulators. I realized this was not a rare occurrence but an epidemic that people were ashamed to talk about because the victims felt stupid and the families felt powerless. I worked with local organizations to develop educational materials about recognizing financial and emotional exploitation, and I found a sense of purpose in turning my painful experience into something that might help others avoid similar nightmares. The lesson about family bonds became crystal clear through this experience. Healthy families support independence while maintaining connection. Toxic people who genuinely care about you do not demand that you cut off everyone who loves you as proof of your commitment. When someone isolates you from your support system, that is not love. That is control. Ethan told me that one of the biggest red flags he missed was how Cassidy always found reasons why we could not spend time with extended family, how she always had some conflict or complaint that prevented normal family interaction. He said his therapist helped him understand that isolation is the first and most important step in manipulation because it removes the outside perspectives that might help the victim see the truth. Patricia and I made a family commitment that we would always stay connected, that we would speak up if we saw concerning patterns in each other's relationships, and that no romantic partner would ever come between our fundamental family bonds. The lesson about truth versus secrets was perhaps the most nuanced. I had kept the secret about owning the house, believing I was protecting Ethan's independence and my own ability to help if needed. But secrets create vulnerability because they can be discovered and weaponized. If I had simply told Ethan from the beginning that I wanted to help him by providing a good rental situation, we could have had honest conversations about boundaries and expectations. The secret itself became more problematic than the help would have been. Ethan told me he wished I had trusted him with the truth, because part of what made Cassidy's manipulation effective was his feeling that I was hiding things, which made her accusations seem more plausible. We talked extensively about how to balance privacy with honesty, how to help adult children without undermining their autonomy, and how transparency might sometimes feel uncomfortable but is healthier than well-intentioned deception. 1 year after that disastrous wedding day, I hosted Thanksgiving at my house, and it felt like a true celebration of survival and renewal. Ethan brought a new girlfriend named Sarah, whom he had been dating for 3 months. Sarah was a veterinarian, warm and confident, with a career she loved and no apparent interest in anyone's financial situation beyond her own stability. What struck me most was how Sarah interacted with our family. She asked questions about family stories and traditions. She wanted to know about Thomas and expressed genuine interest in seeing photo albums. She insisted on helping in the kitchen despite being a guest. She laughed easily and seemed comfortable with the normal chaos of family dinner. When Patricia made a joke at Ethan's expense, Sarah laughed and added her own teasing comment, showing she was not there to defend him from his own family but to become part of that dynamic. These small things that should have been normal but had been completely absent with Cassidy showed me that my son was finally in a healthy relationship with someone who valued connection rather than control. During that Thanksgiving dinner, as I watched my family gathered around my table with genuine laughter and warmth, I felt a profound sense of gratitude that we had survived this nightmare intact. We had been damaged, certainly. We had scars that would never fully fade, but we had also been strengthened. We knew now how to recognize manipulation. We understood the value of maintaining family bonds even when they are tested. We had learned that truth, even painful truth, is always better than comfortable lies. Most importantly, we had learned that love means sometimes fighting for people even when they push you away, even when it hurts, even when you might lose, because real love is not about control but about caring enough to take risks for someone else's well-being. As we went around the table sharing what we were thankful for that year, Ethan looked at me with clear eyes and said he was grateful for a mother who loved him enough to tell him hard truths, even when he did not want to hear them, who fought for him when he could not fight for himself, and who never gave up on him even when he had given up on her. He said he was grateful that I had owned that house because in a strange way it had become the trap that caught the predator, the evidence that revealed what he needed to see. Sarah squeezed his hand and said she was grateful to be part of a family that clearly loved each other deeply and was not afraid to show it. Patricia raised her glass and proposed a toast to surviving and thriving, to learning from pain, and to never letting anyone make us doubt the bonds between us again. We all raised our glasses, and in that moment I felt a peace I had not felt since before Thomas died. The final and most important lesson I learned from this nightmare is that love, true love, never demands that you lose yourself or your family to prove its worth. Real love encourages you to maintain your connections, your identity, your support system. Real love makes your life bigger, not smaller. Real love does not require isolation as proof of commitment. When someone asks you to choose between them and everyone else who cares about you, that is not love. That is possession. I think about the young couple who bought the Victorian house, the way they talked about their excitement to host family dinners there, the way they mentioned looking forward to their parents visiting. That is what healthy love looks like. That is the kind of relationship my son deserves, and is finally building with someone who genuinely cares about his happiness rather than his bank account. As I stood at my kitchen sink washing dishes after everyone had left that Thanksgiving evening, I thought about how far we had come in 1 year. The woman standing in this same spot a year ago reading a wedding invitation had been terrified and alone, watching her son marry someone who wanted to destroy their family. The woman standing here now had her son back, had learned painful but valuable lessons, and had turned tragedy into wisdom that might help others. I would not say I was grateful for what Cassidy did to us, but I was grateful for what we learned about ourselves, about each other, and about the unbreakable nature of true family bonds. And as I dried the last dish and turned off the kitchen light, I whispered a thank you to Thomas, wherever he was, for giving us the strength and the love that had ultimately saved us all. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with someone in your family who turned out to be manipulative or controlling? How did you handle it? What warning signs did you see that you maybe ignored at first? Drop your story in the comments below, because I know so many of you have experienced something similar, and sharing these stories helps all of us recognize these patterns earlier. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our stories about real family drama, survival, and redemption. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear it. Anyone who is dealing with a difficult family situation or who knows someone being isolated by a manipulative partner. Your share might be exactly what someone needs to see to recognize what is happening in their own life. Thank you so much for watching, for listening to my story, and for being part of this community where we support each other through life's hardest moments. Remember, you are stronger than you know, your family bonds matter, and the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never be afraid to fight for the people you love. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.